It is known that once upon a time there lived an expert woodworker in Baghdad who built a beautiful pulpit in the latter part of his life. Anyone who saw this minbar would clench their teeth while seeing its beauty and then the fame of this minbar started spreading. It spread so much that every rich person who came to Baghdad would ask him to sell this pulpit to me and donate it to such and such a mosque. But there is always the same answer to the increase that no sir, this member will be decorated. In Al-Aqsa Mosque, people would reply with surprise that Al-Aqsa Mosque isn't the possession of Christians. I used to listen to everyone's talk and give only one answer. I am an artist and I make pulpits. Some brave person will rise up and reclaim Al-Quds, and this member will be his adornment. The story of the pulpit had come to the language of a child in the city. Then a 7-8-year-old child heard the story, but he was more impressed by the spirit of its builder than by the beauty of the pulpit. And then 40 years later, the pulpit
was installed in Al-Aqsa Mosque by the hands of this brave man, whom people know today as Salahuddin Ayyubi. Salahuddin Ayyubi was born in 1138 in Kurdistan. You were born Kurd. His father's name was Najam al-Din Ayyub, who was the ruler of Tikrit Fort. Salah al-Din Ayyub's childhood and early youth were spent in Damascus and Baalbek. He was educated in the madrasas of Baalbek and the Jama Masjid of Damascus. Until the age of 25, the Sultan lived an anonymous but chaste and unblemished life. In the beginning, Saladin was a military officer with Sultan Nuruddin Zanji. Saladin was part of the army that conquered Egypt. The commanders of this army were his uncles, and in 570 AD they also conquered Yemen, and then after the death of Sultan Nuruddin Zanji, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi took over the rule. The purpose of Saladin's life was to free Jerusalem from the Christians. The same Bait al-Maqdis, in which the messenger of Allah, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, led all the prophets, and from where he ascended to the throne, is actually located in the historic city of Jerusalem, which was conquered by Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab in 638 AD. Later, Jerusalem became part of the Islamic Empire. The Islamic Empire grew stronger day by day, and Jerusalem became a city with a Muslim culture and population. But the Muslim Caliph had allowed the followers of all religions to come to Jerusalem for worship and pilgrimage, and it was also announced that if Jews or Christians wanted to stay in Jerusalem for a few days, it was also allowed, so they started singing and dancing in Jerusalem. At that time, the Islamic states were in the hands of the Seljuk Turks, so they requested the Christians to consider the sanctity of Bait al-Maqdis and respect this holy city. Otherwise, strict measures would be taken against them. Meanwhile, a Christian monk, Peter, told some fabricated stories to the people and convinced the Christians that the Muslims were persecuting them. He traveled with his companions to Great Britain, Germany, Italy, Greece, and all major European countries, and incited Christians against Muslims. So in 1095, the Christian Pope held a conference in France, in which the Christians were urged to rise up and liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. He called this war the Holy War. Meanwhile, a rumor was spread all over Europe that Hazrat Isa will come again and end all problems, but their descent will be at the same time when the holy city of Jerusalem will be freed from the occupation of Muslims. This rumor greatly increased the religious zeal of the Christians. The Christian religious leaders made it public that if a thief, even a miscreant, and an evildoer would visit Jerusalem, he would be entitled to heaven. Based on this belief, all kinds of people started coming to Bait al-Maqdis. Million crusaders took part in this battle, so the Christian army began to march towards Jerusalem in hordes. The Christian tribes through which these people passed would be joined by more Christian tribes, and thus their numbers would increase until almost the whole of Europe was marching towards Jerusalem with arms and enthusiasm. When these people reached Jerusalem, they were confronted by the Seljuk army, but after 40 days most of the Seljuks surrendered. Holy was played with the blood of Muslims and entered Jerusalem. According to Muslim history books, the streets of Jerusalem were ankle deep in blood. The bodies of Muslims were scattered all over the city. It was a sign of acquittal that Muslims were thrown down from the roofs of their houses, and they were burned alive. The mosques were full of blood and severed necks of Muslims. About 60,000 Muslims were killed in this 8-day siege. After conquering the city, the Christians reported to the Pope that we had conquered the city, and we had shed the blood of the Muslims in such a way that when we entered the shrine of Hazrat Solomon, our feet were covered in the blood of the Muslims. After the capture of Jerusalem by the Christians, the whole Muslim world was worried, but the Caliph was so weak that he could not do anything. Captured, where Muslims were massacred and women were raped. The great library of the Muslims in Tripoli was burnt, where there were about 1.9 million books on the subjects of philosophy and science. But every upswing has a downswing, so things took a turn for the worse when Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi became the ruler of Egypt. In the year 1186, a military group of Christians, under the guidance of Reginald, attacked the Holy Hijaz for the purpose of occupying Medina. Then Saladin with an army immediately went in pursuit of Reginald, and the two met face to face at the place of Hattin. In 1187, a terrible battle of history was fought at this place of Hattin, in which the Sultan poured such a flammable substance on the enemy's army that the ground caught fire. The result was that 30,000 Christians were killed and as many were taken prisoner. Reginald was captured and the Sultan beheaded him with his own hand. This news of Hattin spread like wildfire in the Christian world, and fear of Saladin spread throughout Europe. 60,000 Christians were crushed by a handful of Muslim armies. After the victory of Hattin, the Sultan turned to Jerusalem, and after a week of bloody war, the Christians surrendered. Jerusalem came back to the Muslims after 91 years. But after the victory, Sultan Salahuddin treated the prisoners fairly. Did you forbid people from all kinds of looting, stopped the carnage, pardoned all the Christians in the city. The merciful Sultan fixed a very small ransom, and allowed those who could not pay it to go without ransom. The way the Sultan treated Christians and Jews won the hearts of the people of the West. But the Crusader rulers of Europe did not accept defeat, so they started preparing for battle. Troops upon troops from Germany, Italy, France, and England left for Palestine. King Richard the Lionheart of England arrived in Palestine with an army. Christendom had never before provided such an immense army. This great army stood at the port of Acre. He conquered Akka. After the conquest of Acre, the Crusaders turned to the Palestinian port of Ashkelon, where he fought against Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi 12 times. In this competition, the Sultan presented examples of bravery, but since no help came from any Muslim government, and especially the Caliph of Baghdad, so the Sultan had to retreat, and in the meantime the Sultan completed the preparations for Bait al-Maqdis, because now the next target of the Crusaders was Bait al-Maqdis. In 1190, the Third Crusade began, in which the short army of the Sultan bravely faced the great army of Europe. When no hope of victory remained, the Crusaders finally pleaded for peace. Historians have written that during the war, when King Richard the Lion and Sultan Saladin faced each other, Richard's horse fell with a single blow from the Sultan and he died. Richard was standing in a helpless position. The Sultan could have finished his job in one blow if he wanted, but it was the Sultan's high spirit that he did not hesitate to strike a helpless person. He ordered his soldiers to bring a horse for the king so that they could fight on horseback. Richard was so impressed by the generosity and kindness of the Sultan that he refused to fight, and the treaty between Saladin determined, according to which Beit al-Maqdis remained in the possession of the Muslims and the city of Akka was given to the Crusaders and allowed pilgrims of all religions to come to Jerusalem. The Sultan not only gave them all kinds of freedom, rather, on his behalf, he invited millions of pilgrims and made arrangements for comfort and convenience. The Sultan's treatment of non-Muslims was in accordance with Islamic teachings, and this is proof that the rights of non-Muslims were protected in the Islamic government in the same way as Muslims. Despite all his conquests and empire, Saladin lived a life of extreme austerity and poverty. Despite being the owner of the 5 richest kingdoms, namely Syria, Iran, Egypt, Hejaz, and Yemen, he had no home of his own and wore the clothes of common soldiers. All his life, he was a scholar of asceticism that he did not even have any land or property and spent his whole life in the desire of Hajj, but due to financial hardship and poverty, you did not get enough time to travel to Beit Allah. He died in 1193 at the age of 55. After his death, only 47 dirhams were recovered from his house. Even his burial could not be done with this money. Therefore, the Qari of Damascus paid for your burial expenses from his own pocket. Today, the same land of Syria and the land of Quds, where mountains of atrocities are being broken on Muslims, this land is again L. If you like this video, then subscribe to the channel and share and comment the video as much as possible.